When it comes to public records, Louisiana law is clear.
The law says that you're supposed to produce these records within 3 days.
Working on a tip after Hurricane Ida, we filed a series of public records requests with the city of Kenner. The first on October 12th, the next 3 days later, and then another and another. For each request, Kenner refused to produce documents.
And sometimes we get a letter, the reporters do, a letter that says, oh, it'll take us 30 days or 45 days or what have you. It's been a lot longer than 3 days, and it's been a lot longer than 45 days. We need to have this information right away because it's newsworthy.
So we filed suit asking a judge to force the city to hand over the records.
Our firm is handling the Fox 8 lawsuit. I'm sure some of you might have heard of it. We believe it's a frivolous lawsuit.
While Kenner scoffed at our filing, a judge sided with our case and ordered the city to hand over the documents immediately.
You know, it seems like the whole city of Kenner is sort of an isle of secrecy.
What we found launched an FBI investigation.
You know what they say, if it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it probably is a duck.
We uncovered possibly millions of dollars in misspent money and backroom deals.
I assert my Fifth Amendment right under the U.S. Constitution and decline to answer.
Do you see how it looks?
I run a construction company. I don't have anything to do with that.
Then how did you decide to hire him?
The whole thing is a cloud, and you really have to wonder what people's motivations are, because they just don't seem rational.
There's a wrongdoing criminally or ethically or morally.
Tonight, we show you the results of our investigation that forced us to sue a mayor and his administration. 50 different public records requests, peeling back potential corruption in the city that's home to our area's airport. Here's Isle of Secrecy. The city of Kenner didn't want its citizens to know it paid out tens of thousands of dollars in disaster pay to a select group of employees in the months following Hurricane Ida. The pay to one employee, though, stood out. An employee responsible for oversight of the city's most lucrative contracts. We sued for documents, then made at least 50 additional public records requests and uncovered potential corruption, mismanagement, and misspending. And it all starts with our first story, the first set of documents we finally received on disaster pay following the September storm. On the day before Christmas, the city of Kenner wrote Deputy Chief Administrative Officer Chad Pitfield a check nearly double his normal pay. The reason why? Disaster pay from a storm nearly 4 months earlier.
This shows, at the minimum, a lack of accountability and oversight by Kenner.
For that December paycheck, Kenner paid Pitfield for his typical 70 hours of work over 2 weeks, then paid him for an additional 77 hours of disaster work. The disaster pay, $5,800. Kenner says it's paying Pitfield and a handful of other salaried directors based on a 2002 policy. The policy applies to days the city was closed due to the emergency and says if a director works, the city pays their normal scheduled hours and then pays them again for any actual hours worked. For example, if a director was scheduled to work 7 hours and actually worked 15 hours, they get paid 7 hours of regular pay and an additional 15 hours of disaster pay. But there's a problem. Remember, the policy states directors make this extra money when the city is closed due to an emergency. According to several communications, including this post on Facebook, Kenner's government offices opened back up on September 27th. So that pay to Pitfield in December appears to be against Kenner's own policy. In fact, Kenner paid Pitfield nearly $50,000 in disaster pay after the city reopened.
That's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money that the taxpayers in Kenner are paying for, and it's not understandable to me why the city of Kenner, when the policy is very clear, it only applies when the city offices are closed, why they would nevertheless invoke and apply that policy on days that the government is open, when the whole point of it was to give the basic employees their basic pay because they couldn't work through no fault of their own, but they are working. So why are they applying this policy? It makes no sense. And again, it's either negligence or intentional wrongdoing.
Pitfield's not the only Kenner employee who got paid disaster pay after the September reopening. But there's more. In a statement, the city of Kenner told us this policy has been in place since 2002 in Kenner, and FEMA has approved and reimbursed the city after emergency events since then, including hurricanes and an ice storm. But we found a 2007 report by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Inspector General. The report says after Katrina, Kenner closed its offices and automatically paid its employees regular pay. The report notes in addition to receiving the regular pay, employees who worked during the emergency received pay for all additional hours worked. In essence, the city paid its employees twice for the same hours. This is the exact same policy Kenner used after last year's storm. The Inspector General said those payments from 2005 should be disallowed. So while Kenner tells us FEMA approved this policy since 2002, an Inspector General report says those costs shouldn't be allowed, something FEMA concurred with.
After Katrina, Kenner asked for reimbursement from FEMA. FEMA said, no, this is inappropriate. We're not paying you. That was, 16 years ago? And now they did exactly the same thing. And either they have asked FEMA or they're going to ask FEMA for reimbursement. What do you think FEMA's going to say? They're going to say no, because we told you so 16 years ago.
Former Kenner Mayor Mike Yenny told us by phone recently this is a flagrant abuse of power. Yenny said he used this policy for a short period of time during emergencies while he was mayor, at most 2 weeks, adding, why someone would pay for that long of time is beyond me. We asked around to see if other parishes have similar policies. None did. St. Charles Parish paid its salaried employees overtime after Ida, but only for 3 weeks. St. John Parish paid overtime for 45 days. Terrebonne Parish gave salaried employees additional vacation time, capped at a maximum of 5 days. Lafourche Parish paid overtime to some salaried employees, but get this, for the October 15th pay period, Lafourche paid its salaried employees a total of $11,000 in overtime, about the same amount of money Kenner paid to one employee during that time period, Chad Pitfield. St. Charles, St. John, Terrebonne, Lafourche all stopped their emergency policies for pay by mid-October, while Kenner kept paying and paying. For Chad Pitfield, all totaled since September, it meant an additional $86,000 of pay last year. Much of it appears to be against Kenner's own policy.
This is the government that's financed by the taxpayers. The government has rules and regulations. They're obliged to follow them. They want to change them. They can go through the political process and change them, but they haven't done that. So why are they just on an ad hoc basis making things up and doing these things? I don't understand why they're flouting their own policies. Again, only two explanations: negligence, asleep at the wheel, or intentional wrongdoing. Neither of those is a good answer.
Our findings about the spending made Kenner residents furious.
That is astounding. That is disrespectful to us as citizens. That is a slap in the face. Accountability was lost. So do I think we, as the taxpayers, and doing what you do as long as you have, that's usually what happens. We end up eating what a politician does wrong.
The Kenner City Council called for immediate changes after our stories, with one council member proposing a new policy to provide better oversight.
I don't like what I'm hearing, because it's a big red flag. Our citizens, I'm sure they don't like what they're hearing either. So it's our job as council persons to step up and try and fix what is broken. And I think this is broken.
The average citizen in the city of Kenner, particularly my district, their income is a third of $86,000 that they make for a year. So to be able to pay one person that amount of money in a 3-month time period, 3 different pay periods, is very alarming. And for everyone in my district that I have spoken to, it is somewhat insulting.
The council reformed the disaster pay policy in March, tightening the restrictions. After refusing our interview request for a month, Kenner Mayor Ben Zahn finally agreed to sit down and talk with us. He claimed the taxpayer money was well spent, despite the spending being much higher than what was given to high-level officials in other hard-hit areas.
How do you defend paying one employee over a 4-month period $86,000 in disaster pay?
I think when you look at it from our point of view, where you're saying that FEMA is going to step in and pay that, as you've been told by Liz, she's confident, believes that that'll be paid for. And the guys and the ladies that slept on the floor of a trailer, that had no running water, had powered the trailer, but had no services for themselves, that they had to make sure the services were back. I think the average person, with me now coming out saying what happened and with Liz saying what has happened, understand that those services were restored because people gave their time away from their families.
I understand that, but that's September, maybe even to October, but paying continuing in October, in November, in December, how do you justify that?
Because, Lee, things weren't completed yet. And if you go back and we look at, and I'm sure Liz is going to supply that to you, you maybe been supplied already the hours, you see the things that they were still doing in those months. Restoring services is one thing. Continuing making those services go.
The Liz Zahn is referring to is Elizabeth Herring, the city's chief financial officer. Herring says she's been in contact with FEMA since the storm and expects to be reimbursed for all of these disaster expenses.
It's the same policy we've been having for years. It didn't come from this administration. We have been reimbursed under this exact same policy in previous disasters. I just don't see any problems with that part of it.
You said you've been reimbursed in past storms over this. What is the most days employees have been reimbursed in past storms for disaster pay?
So it's a little hard to compare storms, right?
Again, for Ida, select Kenner employees were paid for 4 months. We wanted to see if that's happened in the past. Kenner couldn't tell us. At least one former Kenner mayor said it didn't happen under his watch. City officials say the damage of this storm for the city is more severe than any other. $100 million of damage for Ida, compared to nearly $48 million for Katrina, just under $2 million for Isaac. Kenner City Hall was damaged by the wind and rain of Hurricane Ida. A temporary facility was opened last year. The policy that Kenner cites for disaster pay clearly states it's only paid while the city is closed due to an emergency. Kenner city government and all services opened up in the end of September.
But it's open. It's open.
Yes.
So you have a temporary city hall open, so why are you still paying disaster pay?
Because we're still doing things that we've had to do. And we'd have to check and see where the disaster pay.
But I mean, every parish and every parish who is around is going to be dealing with Ida issues for a long time. There's no end in sight.
That's going to be a question.
No, it's a question for you. You're the mayor. There's no end in sight. When are you going to stop this?
It's a question that I have to check with the CFO because, like I said in the beginning, I'm not doing the job of the CFO. I'm doing the job of overseeing lots of things that are going on, and I trust the CFO. I trust my administration. I'll be glad to get back to you and give you a timeline on that.
Hours after the interview, city officials told us the disaster pay stopped. The last disaster paycheck went to employees the day after our initial story on this pay ran. We only received those records after Kenner wouldn't hand them over, and we sued the city. A judge ruled in our favor. Last year, Lafourche Parish paid its parish administrator $118,000, its director of public works $124,000, two high-level jobs, and those payments include some overtime both directors made in the weeks following Hurricane Ida. Neither earned close to what Kenner paid Deputy CAO Chad Pitfield, a total of $223,000, including $86,000 in disaster pay in 4 months. Lafourche Parish has a larger population and had more damage due to Ida.
We collect records from every government many years. We've talked to Lafourche, Terrebonne, St. John, St. Charles, parishes who were hit very hard by this. No one has paid an employee like you paid Chad Pitfield.
There's an employee there that has done a lot. All of our employees did a lot of work, but you have one employee who has done consistent work throughout different hours. before 8:30 and past 4:30.
No other parish or entity has done that.
Maybe they don't have a Chad Pitfield.
Our questions in this story really come down to one thing: a policy written in 2002 that directed salaried employees to earn extra pay while the city was closed due to an emergency. It's how Kenner justified the payments when we started asking questions. So it still raises this question. Since Kenner reopened in late September, why were several employees, including Chad Pitfield, continuing to receive extra pay?
But you're not following your policy.
Well, most administrations have never had to deal with what you're looking at here. City Hall, does this look open? This City Hall right here is not open.
But the city government's open.
City government's open, and city government was open. City government had to continue in some type of form, and that's what we continue to do.
But late September, city government, the offices reopened.
You're going on a Facebook post that we put out, not a legal document. There's a legal way of doing it. There is a Facebook post. We went on a Facebook post that we were restoring City Hall to the people of Kenner. Like I said, City Hall has never taken this much devastation before.
But the city was open.
City was
City
open.
government was open. The policy says for employees who essentially aren't essential and they don't come into work, they can stay at home but still get paid. And then the people who are working, who are essential, still get their money, but then they also get this additional money for any hours they are working. Well, those employees who were at home had returned to work and were getting paid.
Correct.
So the policy was not being followed.
Right. The policy was written years ago. We were following the policy to where we felt we needed to follow it.
The more we dug into Pitfield's timesheets, the more problems we found.
If I was living in the city of Kenner and I'm paying taxes in Kenner to operate the city of Kenner's government, I'm saying, who's watching the store here? This is money just going out the door because nobody is paying attention.
More in the findings that Pitfield tried to alter his timesheets after we discovered he double dipped. That's coming up. As we dug into Chad Pitfield's timesheets, we found he claimed to be in two places at once, which raised questions about the work he was actually doing. No other parish or entity has done that.
Maybe they don't have a Chad Pitfield.
Kenner Mayor Ben Zahn says no other parish or city has an employee with the work ethic of his deputy chief administrative officer. In the 4 months following Hurricane Ida, Zahn had no hesitation paying Chad Pitfield $86,000 in disaster pay. His total pay last year, nearly $230,000.
Do you believe that Chad works all the hours he says he does?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if the people that I've surrounded myself in my administration that I've chosen, I trust that what they're turning in is absolutely correct.
But our review of records shows that might be incorrect.
This is very distressing, Lee.
October 22nd, about 8 weeks after Hurricane Ida made landfall, City of Kenner records show Pitfield worked a 14-hour day, 7 in the morning until 9 at night, 2,100 hours. In addition to working for Kenner, Pitfield also volunteers as a reserve deputy for the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office. On that same day, October 22nd, reserve timesheets show Pitfield spent 4 hours at the DA's office prepping for a trial. The records indicate Pitfield worked on that trial from noon until 4. During the same time period, Kenner paid him for those 4 hours of work, where he told the city he made street assessments for debris collection.
If I was living in the city of Kenner and I'm paying taxes in Kenner to operate the city of Kenner's government, I'm saying, who's watching the store here? This is money just going out the door because nobody is paying attention.
For that reserve commitment, Pitfield's timesheet shows he spent 4 hours in training, what's called Block 2 training, beginning at 8 a.m. on November 15th. But Kenner timesheets showed during that same 4-hour block, Pitfield reviewed debris reports and did street assessments. Pitfield essentially alleging he was in two places at one time.
Yeah, and the Block 2 training is something specific at our academy. He would have had an appointment for that. We verified that he completed that training, so he was here at 8 a.m. To do that training on that particular date. So that again, you shouldn't have a conflict of those times between his Kenner time and that. Again, I haven't seen the Kenner records, but I don't deny that they probably exist for him.
You want me to show them to you?
Yeah, I mean, this is a log that I've seen, and it doesn't, it's a handwritten log that shows that time, and there's certainly a conflict on it, and that's certainly something that they should be addressing.
When we interviewed Kenner Mayor Ben Zahn, we wanted to show him our findings.
Does it concern you if that's the case?
Oh, absolutely would concern me, but I have not seen something that's contrary to what I believe. So if you have something to show to us, then that would be a different story.
Do you want me to show? I mean, I can show it to you.
Have you shown it to the sheriff?
I have not yet.
Okay, well, I'd rather the sheriff weigh in on that first, because that's bringing the sheriff of Jefferson Parish into it and JPSO, and I'd like to see what he says first.
Is it concerning to you that this paperwork shows that it could potentially be doing two things at one time?
Lee, it's like anything. The human beings can make mistakes. I look for a pattern, right? And so if there's a pattern where we have several times that are really look like double dipping, there's an issue. Is that date right? I know that I get dates wrong in my calendar all the time when I'm plugging them into my phone. That's something that he's got to address. I mean, it's not something that should be overlooked by any means, but there's certainly a conflict on the papers.
We found more irregularities when we matched Pitfield's timesheets to his Jefferson Parish records. Pitfield has a swipe card for access to some Jefferson Parish Sheriff buildings. On the 26th of November, Pitfield's swipe card was used to enter the Academy parking gate at 14:16 or 2:16 in the afternoon. But Kenner records show the city paid Pitfield for work during that same time. But there's more. To help justify and track FEMA reimbursements following the storm, Kenner had employees fill out these forms. The employees sign off on the accuracy of each one. Here's how the city's chief financial officer explained the process.
Do the employees fill that out every day, once a week? They fill out for the week? How does that work?
So typically they would fill it out every day as long as they are doing, responding to the storm. Any type of work that is directly related to the storm, they would definitely track that just so that they can submit that to us, for reimbursement.
So typically if an employee works at the end of the day, they mark their time and then they send it to you?
Yes, correct. It goes to a specific email where we can track, collect them all, and then they're filed.
But I guess my point is, you're fairly confident that the forms are accurate because they're submitting them each day right after.
Correct.
The reserve duties for the sheriff allows Pitfield to work paid details. Pitfield worked a detail at Lafreniere Park on November 7th from 6 until 10 at night. But his Kenner records show he did street and streetlight assessments during that entire detail. On November 21st, similar finding, detail from 6 until 10 at night. During the same time, he reviewed debris plans and maps. After we raised these questions with the mayor, we received an email 24 hours later that the forms had a clerical error with the date. Corrections had been made and initialed in the document. An unnamed person crossed out November 7th and replaced it with November 3rd, and November 21st became November 25th. That means instead of working on the 21st, Pitfield is now alleging he worked for 5 hours on Thanksgiving night during the entire Saints game.
That's more than coincidental, Lee. You know what they say, if it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it probably is a duck.
The questions with Pitfield's schedule don't stop with Kenner. We found irregularities when we matched some paid details with his Jefferson Parish Sheriff swipe card. On November 14th, Pitfield worked a 4-hour detail at the park, 1,800 to 2,200 hours, 6 to 10 at night. But at 7:53, Pitfield's card was swiped at the sheriff's office gate, 5 miles away at 3300 Metairie Road. We even found an example before Ida, July 25th. Pitfield worked that same 6 to 10 detail at Lafreniere Park. The last hour of his shift, his card was swiped to enter the front door of the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, far away from Lafreniere Park, again while being paid to work a detail. Days after we started asking questions, Pitfield resigned from his JPSO duties. Tulane law professor Joel Friedman says this story raises the question, What did Kenner actually receive for the $86,000 in disaster pay that hit one employee's bank account?
There's no accountability here. I'll bet there's nobody in the CFO's office that actually looks at these things. They just get them and they pay. Because if they looked at them, they'd say, gee, he wrote down on, September 19th that he did this. He wasn't here doing that. But they don't.
After our story aired that showed Pitfield claimed to be in two places at once, he claimed he made a clerical error. But we uncovered documents appearing to show he changed his timesheets to try to cover up the double dipping.
An email trail that seems to catch a highly paid employee in a predicament.
He tried to cover up the first lie with an additional lie.
A now former public employee who the Kenner mayor says is unmatched in the public sector.
Maybe they don't have a Chad Pitfield.
We have several instances of now former City of Kenner Deputy CAO Chad Pitfield double dipping, working for the City of Kenner and Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office at the same time. We're going to focus in on one of those instances because of new documents we just received.
Nobody's looking, Lee. Nobody's caring.
Kenner records showed on November 7th of last year, Chad Pitfield worked from 5 to 11 at night doing street and streetlight assessments. For that work, Pitfield received extra disaster pay from Kenner that Kenner hopes to get reimbursed by FEMA. That same night, Pitfield also worked a paid detail through the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office. He's a reserve deputy, and on November 7th, timesheets show he worked from 6 until 10, a 4-hour overlap of his Kenner workday. When we started to ask questions, Pitfield made some changes. On February 1st, he sent an email to the Kenner CAO and CFO, noting he put an incorrect date on the form and corrected and initialed the changes. Instead of working November 7th, Pitfield changed it to November 3rd. Pitfield essentially claiming he didn't double dip, but just made a mistake on the date on his timesheet. So we asked the City of Kenner for all records related to Pitfield's leave and vacation days in November of last year. It shows on November 2nd, Pitfield sent an email to the CAO and CFO telling them he'd take off the next day, November 3rd. There's the leave form signed by Pitfield. So when Pitfield alleges he worked on November 3rd instead of the 7th, these records indicate that's impossible.
It was quite a clumsy effort on his part to cover his tracks. He stupidly decided to change the date to a date when in fact he wasn't working because he had already taken vacation on that date.
Tulane law professor Joel Friedman says Pitfield could have now committed 2 offenses, double dipping and then the act of trying to cover it up.
And the fact that this goes on and that the City of Kenner let him change the date and didn't go and check and say, hey, Chad, you changed the date to a date when you were on vacation. Nobody's looking, Lee. Nobody's caring. Nobody's checking at the City of Kenner. It's a cesspool of corruption or at least incompetence.
Days after our story aired on the double dipping and the possible cover-up, Kenner Mayor Ben Zahn fired Pitfield, terminating his employment with the city just weeks after praising his work and work ethic. The City of Kenner performed an internal audit that backed up our findings that Pitfield tried to cover up his double dipping. And it found Pitfield marked on his November 25th timesheet that he hadn't worked any hours that day because it was Thanksgiving, meaning he couldn't have worked that day instead of November 21st. The audit concluded the once heralded employee falsified 2 public documents and likely broke the law. Pitfield is now the target of a federal investigation. The FBI issued subpoenas to the City of Kenner asking for a lengthy list of records related to Pitfield and asked for his detail and swipe card records from the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office. All of that coming after our reports aired. Kenner residents are eager for the results of the investigation.
I want indictments to come down. I want people to be held accountable for what they did. They're stealing from us.
We also found questionable connections between Pitfield and a Kenner contract worth millions of dollars.
I mean, that raises serious ethical questions.
More on possible backroom deals and questionable spending coming up. Months before Hurricane Ida, Kenner Mayor Ben Zahn curiously promoted his recreation director, Chad Pitfield, to deputy CAO and had him oversee the city's most lucrative and important contracts. Some of the documents we reviewed for these next stories, also ones we had to sue the city of Kenner to hand over. As Zahn rewarded Pitfield with nearly $90,000 in disaster pay, Pitfield's lax oversight and potential conflicts could have cost taxpayers millions of dollars. As you'll see in the following stories, we uncovered questionable move after questionable move.
This is very distressing.
Stacks of records that raise questions about whether Kenner is being overcharged for garbage.
They appear to be, again, totally asleep at the wheel.
I want to thank Sydney for what you've done, along with Ivy Waste, making this a reality here.
Ivy Waste is Kenner's trash collector and operates a drop-off site for Kenner residents to drive up with trash and debris.
Residential trash and debris only.
Last year, Ivy billed Kenner $550,000 for collecting and hauling trash and debris dropped off at the site. Ivy bills Kenner $350 each time residents fill up one of these 30-yard containers. Monthly, Ivy submits an invoice with a log of each date that container is emptied, and then submits a more detailed account of each individual charge, providing a work order with the receipt from the landfill to prove that garbage was delivered to the dump. But our review of invoices sent to Kenner, along with more than 2 weeks of undercover surveillance, raises questions about Kenner's checks and balances and whether the city might be paying more than it should. Here's a receipt from the 13th of November. The ticket from the landfill suggests this trash came from the Jung Hotel on Canal Street in New Orleans. That cost Kenner residents $350. Or look at November 12th, 14 separate charges. Ivy charged Kenner nearly $4,900, essentially claiming residents filled up 14 of these containers in one day. Kenner makes residents who drop off trash sign in and prove their residency. The sign-in sheet that day shows only 12 residents visited the drop-off site. So IV is essentially claiming each of those 12 residents brought enough trash and debris to fill up more than one of those containers each. We reached a few by phone who said they dropped off trash and debris in a pickup truck or small trailer. On that day, Ivy billed Kenner for 14 containers, but Kenner only has the required backup documentation for 2. We have no proof more than 2 containers had been dumped at the landfill. On October 11th, Ivy billed Kenner for 34 containers, claiming these containers were dumped 34 times one day. But Kenner doesn't have documentation to prove those 34 containers were dumped from trash at the drop-off site. In fact, when you compare all of the billings from the drop-off site and the adjacent Kenner yard to the detailed receipts, we found charges for $325,000 unaccounted for in the backup invoices. No proof the trash was dumped, yet the documents show the city of Kenner approved the invoices and paid the bill without asking any questions. On January 16th of this year, one of the days our undercover camera recorded the drop-off site, Ivy billed for dumping 6 different containers. Our cameras caught the vehicles of the 8 Kenner residents that signed into the dump to drop off trash, most coming in small trucks or trailers. Experts in the industry told us it would be nearly impossible for these 8 drivers to fill up 6 different containers that look something like this.
This is unacceptable. Why aren't they more accountable? Why isn't the city of Kenner more careful about paying these bills?
We sent Ivy Waste a lengthy email detailing all of the findings in this story. The company declined an on-camera interview and in a statement told us Kenner approved all work pursuant to the contract and the emergency orders necessitated by Hurricane Ida. If there are clerical mistakes by Ivy Waste or by Kenner, there are true-up mechanisms in place to correct them. Ivy told us in a follow-up letter, Ivy anticipates that this story will reflect the fact that Ivy Waste has not cheated Kenner in any way, but rather has provided Kenner with excellent service at a cost comparable, if not less expensive than its predecessor provider. Tulane law professor Joel Friedman places the blame on the city of Kenner.
Who's paying these bills? Is it the CFO of Kenner?
The person who has oversight and is supposed to be reviewing the invoices is Chad Pitfield.
Oh my God, Chad Pitfield.
Chad Pitfield, the deputy CAO and subject of our previous investigation, who Kenner paid $86,000 in disaster pay, who we found might have double-dipped working for the Jefferson Parish Sheriff and Kenner at the same time. Kenner terminated Pitfield's employment after our stories. The city of Kenner is involved in a lawsuit with its former garbage collector, Romelli Waste. Video depositions from that suit confirm Pitfield had oversight of the invoices and contract.
Chad does the field operations, so now, IV being the one of the providers, Chad reviews those.
Chad Pitfield, I'd have to check with him, who's handling most of this.
So Chad Pitfield would be the person who signs off?
I think you'd get more information from him because he handles it every day.
Chad Pitfield will be responsible for the overall operations.
In fact, in the initial draft IV contract, the Director of Public Works had oversight of IV's work. But by the time the contract was signed, that changed from Public Works to the Chief Administrative Officer or her designee. Kenner reworked the contract to allow Pitfield to have oversight. And that's where this story takes an interesting turn. Sources tell us while Pitfield worked for the city of Kenner, he set up IV Waste's Instagram account and posted on behalf of IV Waste to that account. And as Kenner's deputy CAO, he approved IV Waste invoices while having an IV Waste email address.
If you're responsible for looking at invoices totaling $500,000 or more a month, should you have an email address with the company you're overseeing?
Of course not. Why would you have an email address? Companies don't give their own email addresses to people unless their employees are in some other way affiliated with the company.
In that statement, IV Waste told us at no time did IV Waste ever pay Chad Pitfield to manage any social media account on its behalf or to work for IV Waste in any capacity.
If he has a relationship with IV, that fact alone creates a conflict of interest in any normal operation, let alone a public one funded by taxpayers. The person with a linkage to a company would never be the person in charge of paying funding to that company.
Kenner Mayor Ben Zahn and his administration have refused to answer questions on camera about IV Waste because of that ongoing lawsuit. But Tulane law professor Joel Friedman says these documents show at the very least Kenner needs to do a better job overseeing work and billings that have cost taxpayers millions of dollars.
We continue digging into IV Waste, its contract and work, going back to the first work IV did for the city. Legal experts say it also appears Pitfield may have rigged a bidding process for the contract to clean up after the ISIS Carnival Parade in Kenner. In 2020, the city needed a team to clean up after the 17 float parade. Emails show Pitfield started to solicit bids, reaching out to River Parish Disposal and Romelli Waste. At the time, Romelli was still serving as the city's garbage collector. However, when Romelli submitted its bid to Pitfield, Pitfield forwarded that bid to IV Waste owner Sidney Torres. 9 days later, IV Waste sent its own bid for $750 less than Romelli's. If you're a vendor and how do you know you're going to get a fair shake in Kenner?
You don't. And after this, you would have to you would be very suspicious. I mean, anybody seeing this would be like, wait a minute, why should I submit a bid at all in Kenner if they're just going to take my bid, give it to the person that they really want, and that person is just going to underbid me, and then they're going to pretend like it was an open and fair, inequitable process, when in reality they're just sharing my confidential bid with another competitor so that he can undercut me. I mean, it doesn't really make any sense. I mean, there's no basic sense of fairness here.
In a statement, IV Waste said to suggest that IV Waste was provided a copy of a proposal by Romelli, which prompted IV Waste to produce slightly less, is patently false. Recycling prices also jumped under IV Waste, with Kenner paying more than double last year than what it paid in 2020. But documents show less trash was recycled. For more than a month after Hurricane Ida, the city of Kenner suspended recycling. Yet despite that, Ivy Waste billed and Kenner paid nearly $46,000 for recycling removal that month. In mid-October, recycling resumed. But during October and November, records show Ivy Waste didn't bring any recycling to the facility in Baton Rouge. Despite not dropping off a single item at the Baton Rouge facility, Ivy charged Kenner $46,000 each month. Chad Pitfield oversaw this work too and never questioned a thing.
Of course Kenner's residents should be outraged. This is thousands and thousands of dollars. I mean, it's not like the city has so much money they can just throw it away for nothing. I mean, look at all the services people aren't being provided for now. They're not getting the trash recovery that they used to get and the amount of recycling, and now paying for work that's not even been done. This is outrageous. But there's no way the average person can know because the city is not doing anything about it. The only way they find out is from you.
We reviewed 18 months of recycling billings and invoices that raised serious questions about Pitfield's oversight of the contract. We also found that while IV was billing Kenner for recycling at nearly 23,000 homes, it had actually only distributed recycling bins to 7,000 homes. In a statement, IV said it followed its contract as far as billing for all of the homes it passes each week. Kenner is locked in a legal battle over removing Romelli as its garbage collector. We reviewed videos and emails related to that civil case, which raised questions about the behind-the-scenes dealings in Kenner. Here's how a trusted advisor to the mayor was involved in the Ivy Waste contract.
Based on the advice of my counsel, I assert my Fifth Amendment right under the U.S. Constitution and decline to answer.
A powerful behind-the-scenes politico in Jefferson Parish refuses to answer questions.
Who do you presently provide consulting services to?
Again, my objection is privilege, and he will assert his privilege.
Based on the advice of my counsel, I assert my Fifth Amendment right under the U.S. Constitution and decline to answer.
During a 1-hour, 24-minute deposition, this power broker asserted his Fifth Amendment rights.
It's the right against self-incrimination.
At least 120 times.
I assert my Fifth Amendment rights. I assert my Fifth Amendment right under the U.S. Constitution and decline to answer. Based on the advice of counsel, I assert my Fifth Amendment right under the U.S. Constitution. Decline to answer.
In a civil lawsuit involving the city of Kenner's trash contract, Nikki Nicolosi spent much of this deposition dodging questions from the attorney of the former Kenner trash collector, Romelli Janitorial Service.
But the reason someone takes the Fifth is so they don't incriminate themselves.
Yes. It's essentially telling the government, if you want to prosecute somebody and get evidence, you have to get it from somebody else, not from the mouth of the person. They have a right to remain silent.
This is a story about more than $100,000 in payments to one person, paid by this businessman.
Hey, Lee Zurich, how are you? Good to see you.
Good. And a story that includes behind-the-scenes video and documents that raise questions about a multi-million-dollar contract paid with taxpayer money. This story starts on December 20th, 2019.
I think I can work with Romelli, obviously, because it's been proven we can work with Romelli.
There's Kenner Mayor Ben Zahn praising his garbage collector at the time, Romelli Waste, at a council meeting.
This is a sweetheart deal for the city of Kenner and for its residents. I find it really, really disrespectful to say that Romelli would want to do a breach of contract when Romelli has stepped up to the plate and offered all these new services.
But just 3 weeks later, after the holidays, Zahn did a 180 and decided to dump Romelli as his trash contractor and hire Ivy Waste instead. And this is where Nikki Nicolosi enters the story. Nicolosi has been around Jefferson Parish politics most of his life. Kenner Mayor Ben Zahn calls him a trusted advisor.
How long have you known Nikki?
Probably since I'm like late teens, early 20s.
And how did you come to meet Mr. Nicolosi?
I've always been involved in city politics, just around the city of Kenner.
Did you socialize with Mr. Nicolosi?
Absolutely.
Nicolosi has worked as a consultant for a few city vendors, including back in 2019 for Romelli. Days after that December council meeting, Zahn says he raised a few questions about Romelli's service after residents called to report that Christmas trees that were supposed to be recycled were spotted being put into the back of garbage trucks, and Romelli delayed building a garbage drop-off site and had a lack of recycling carts. So Zahn says he went to Nicolosi for help. Zahn says Nicolosi told him Romelli wouldn't budge. Zahn never met with the owner of Romelli, and instead, about 2.5 weeks after praising Romelli, based on one conversation with Nicolosi, Zahn decided to dump the trash contractor. Here's a look at the timeline. December 20th, 2019. Zahn praised Romelli at the council meeting. But less than 3 weeks later, January 7th, testimony in these depositions reveals Zahn and Nicolosi met and started discussing hiring IV Waste. 10 days later, January 17th, Zahn met with Nicolosi and IV Waste to discuss working with Kenner, while Nicolosi was still on Romelli's payroll.
If you're working for one vendor, should you ethically be in a meeting talking about another vendor or moving the contract to another vendor?
No, I mean, that raises serious ethical questions because, it's all about transparency. And so who are you really working for? I mean, I think the taxpayers have the right to know, who are you working for? Whose interests are you representing? And if you have somebody who's floating back and forth between vendors, I think that raises some ethical questions as to who that person is actually representing.
On January 23rd, Nicolosi accepted a calendar invite for a meeting with IV Waste and City of Kenner officials. The next day, he quit Romelli. Then on January 27th, attended that meeting. In early February, there's Nicolosi on an email. The first draft contract with IV Waste had been crafted. Kenner didn't do a public bid for a new contract, but in a matter of days decided to essentially cancel Romelli's contract and move on to IV Waste. In May of 2020, IV Waste took over the contract and became the city's garbage collector. Nicolosi works as a consultant for two other Kenner contractors, Digital Engineering and Solution. But IV Waste owner Sidney Torres has been adamant he didn't hire Nicolosi.
There's been a lot of accusations made in the news about backroom deals, and it's very offensive to hear that because there is no backroom deals here. Nick does not work for me, and the accusation saying he worked for me, that there was backroom deals, is just not true.
In a statement, Torres told us at no time did IV Waste pay Mr. Nicolosi directly or indirectly any money or anything of value to be an employee or a consultant to IV Waste. But videos and documents raise questions about Nicolosi's involvement with the garbage contract.
It seems like the whole city of Kenner is sort of an aisle of secrecy that you really have to dig into to understand what's going on.
While IV Waste and Kenner worked on the contract details, emails show Nicolosi was included in the communication. In early March 2020, a draft press release shows IV planned to hire Nicolosi as a consultant. Sidney Torres did respond to that draft that Nicolosi is not hired yet, and we will see. Then in April, Nicolosi started posting on Facebook giving Kenner residents instructions about IV's rollout. Or this one, IV coming to a neighborhood near you soon. In this video shot by the city of Kenner, also from April, right before IV took over the contract, that's Nicolosi off camera, telling Torres the days his company would be picking up trash.
Today, Friday and Tuesday, Saturday and Wednesday, Monday and Thursday.
And here's another video in May of 2020 when IV took over the contract. There's Torres and Mayor Ben Zahn touring neighborhoods. And there's Nicolosi leaning against the truck in the background. And during a conversation with a Kenner resident,
I'm going to get with the can guys. Nikki, we need to get with them when we get back to the yard. Yeah.
That's Torres asking Nicolosi to get with the people distributing cans. Torres essentially alleging Nicolosi is helping out for free. While Torres is adamant Nicolosi is not on his payroll and doesn't do work for his company, records show Nicolosi started collecting a paycheck from someone close to Torres the same month Ivy Waste started the Kenner contract. David Karimi owns a construction company. He's a longtime friend of Ivy Waste owner Sidney Torres. The two are business partners.
That's where Ivy Waste comes in. We get a set rate, we get a set delivery time.
In fact, Karimi Construction is based out of a building owned by Karimi and Torres. And Karimi's company built the Kenner residential drop-off site, operated by Ivy Waste. One Sidney Torres says he invested $400,000 in. And here's where that money we told you about earlier comes into play. The same exact month Ivy Waste took over the Kenner trash contract, May of 2020, records show Karimi Construction started writing a company, NBN Services, a monthly $5,800 check. It just so happens one of the only questions Nicolosi would answer in the deposition was this.
Did you start a consulting business?
Yes.
And what was the name of the consulting business?
NBN Services, LLC.
NBN Services, Nikki Nicolosi's consulting company. This document given to Fox 8 shows Nicolosi's company has made more than $100,000 from the business partner and longtime friend of Torres. We caught up with Karimi at his office, where he told us Nicolosi worked as a consultant for him.
I mean, what does he do for you as a consultant?
He helps us get work.
Where?
Municipal type work.
Has he gotten you any work?
We have submitted proposals.
So he hasn't gotten you any work?
None that have been accepted.
So this businessman has paid Nicolosi more than $100,000. And he says in 21 months, Nicolosi has not gotten him a penny of work. Yet every month, Karimi still writes Nicolosi a $5,800 check.
Like the month Mr. Torres starts doing the contract in Kenner, you start paying Mr. Nicolosi?
I don't have anything to do with that.
Okay, but do you see how it looks?
I run a construction company. I don't have anything to do with that. But if you
then
give
how
me a
did you
call,
decide to hire him?
If you give me a call, I'll be happy to meet with you.
Karimi never got back to us or met with us again. In the deposition, Nicolosi wouldn't answer questions about any possible ties to Ivy Waste.
Has Ivy Waste paid you, Mr. Nicolosi, anything to get the garbage contract in the city of Kenner?
Objection. Fifth Amendment privilege.
Based on advice of counsel, I assert my Fifth Amendment rights under the U.S. Constitution and decline to answer.
But Dillard political analyst Dr. Robert Collins says this story raises questions about this trusted advisor to the mayor and a lucrative contract with the city of Kenner.
The whole thing is a cloud, and you really have to wonder what people's motivations are because they just don't seem rational.
Nikki Nicolosi declined to comment on our investigation. Ivy Waste owner Sidney Torres wouldn't do an on-camera interview for our story, but did issue a statement. He says Nicolosi approached Ivy Waste about a job, but Torres declined. Through his attorney, he told us he was aware of David Karimi's firm retaining Nicolosi, but insisted that had nothing to do with Torres or Ivy Waste, and that to imply otherwise would be unfair. Mayor Ben Zahn wouldn't answer questions about the Ivy Waste contract on camera, citing the ongoing lawsuit. But weeks after our investigative story, we were able to report that Nikki Nicolosi is now under federal investigation. A retired CPA believes Kenner also overpaid hundreds of thousands of dollars for trash pickup following Hurricane Ida.
Well, it's like everything else. There's no free lunch, so somebody's paying for it.
Coming up, the questions about hurricane debris and tree removal charges, and more big paychecks for a few select companies. The cleanup job after Hurricane Ida was a big undertaking, but invoices appear to show little to no oversight and double billing. And Chad Pitfield signed off on the spending.
Pretty irate on the surface.
In the months following Hurricane Ida, the city of Kenner paid trash collector Ivy Waste $584,000.
Well, it appears that they charged more than they should have.
Money Ivy Waste claimed it earned in addition to its regular trash collection rate by helping out with extra post-Ida trash pickup.
And if you're a taxpayer,
well, it's like everything else. There's no free lunch, so somebody's paying for it.
But this longtime, now recently retired CPA.
How long were you a practicing CPA?
43 years, 44 years.
Reviewed records and has concluded Ivy Waste likely overcharged the city.
You believe the city of Kenner is owed a significant amount of money?
I think so.
To Pat Lynch, the actual number could be potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. Ivy Waste has a clause in its contract that allows Kenner to execute what's called special collection of bagged organic matter. 3 experts in the industry tell us this is essentially extra residential trash that piles up after storms, as Ivy Waste owner Sidney Torres explained in this video.
We're now going after the bags starting this weekend. We're going to start picking up the bags. We're not picking up the tree debris. There's a different contractor for that.
Invoices show Ivy billed Kenner $584,000 for 9,500 tons of extra trash. But when you compare those numbers to other parishes hit even harder by Ida, on the surface, the Kenner numbers don't seem to make sense. There are the Kenner payments, $584,000 for 9,500 tons of extra trash. Compare that to neighboring St. Charles Parish, $92,000 for only 738 extra tons. Terrebonne Parish government only paid $35,000 for 279 tons, a stark difference from what Ivy Waste billed and received in Kenner. But there's more discrepancies in the paperwork. Ivy Waste sent a list of how much extra tonnage it delivered to the landfill on a daily basis, and for each ton, charged Kenner that $61.17 rate. Look at Thursday, September 9th. Ivy claims it delivered 453.86 tons to the landfill that day. But we reviewed landfill records, which shows the landfill only received 404 tons. So Ivy billed Kenner for 49 more tons that it even delivered that day. And keep in mind, these numbers should be everything in excess of the normal garbage Ivy is already being paid to pick up.
It doesn't make sense.
Something's wrong.
We found many days with that discrepancy, like September 14th. Ivy billed Kenner for 221 tons, but only dumped 214 at the landfill. Or October 10th, Ivy billed for 119 tons, but records show only dumped 110. And we found even more discrepancies. Look at September 12th. Ivy Waste charged Kenner for nearly 53 tons dropped off to the landfill in a roll-off container. But look at the Kenner invoices from the landfill. Ivy Waste didn't bring any trucks assigned to Kenner to the landfill that day. That day, Kenner billed more than $3,200 for trash that doesn't appear to be dropped off at the landfill. The documentation to back up the more than $500,000 in disaster payments is thin. It has a daily count of tonnage delivered that includes a total for each invoice. We've been asking the city of Kenner for the backup documentation to these disaster invoices to support the payments. The city hasn't handed that over, but did sign off on these invoices. Records show the employer responsible for approving them was Chad Pitfield, the former deputy CAO, recently terminated for possible payroll fraud and falsifying public documents. While working for the city of Kenner, Pitfield signed off on payments to Ivy Waste. Sources say he set up Ivy Waste's Instagram account and had a company email address. The extra provision allowed Ivy Waste to bill Kenner up to $200,000. After that, the company needed city approval to earn more. Emails show when Ivy Waste asked for a few increases of the maximum allowed, Pitfield signed off on it via email, writing few words, apparently asking few questions. Ivy and owner Sidney Torres declined our request for an interview. In a statement, the company said Ivy Waste has complied with its contract with Kenner in every way and is billed appropriately. Even in the chaotic conditions created by Ida, all work and every charge to Kenner was approved by Kenner officials. When other residents of the area were watching piles of garbage and storm debris quickly grow in front of their homes and businesses and complaining about it, Ivy Waste was the first garbage contractor collecting and hauling. But the comparisons to other hard-hit areas raise questions about whether the city of Kenner looked out for taxpayers, especially when you compare these costs to the rest of Jefferson Parish. That's because under this special provision in the contract, Kenner paid IV Waste about double the amount in post-Ida trash compared to the rest of Jefferson Parish. When you break it down by household, the Jefferson Parish contractor servicing all of the parish but Kenner billed $11.50 per household. IV Waste breaks down to more than $25 a house in Kenner. Another clear sign to this longtime CPA, the numbers make no sense.
So is it a complete follow-up, or is there something intentional? I couldn't say one way or the other based on what I've seen.
But we know something is not
wrong.
And this needs to be straightened out.
And that's where I say the city needs to get their internal audit department in and look at the records and sit down across the table after they've done that with IV and try to resolve it.
IV Waste told us to compare the work of contractors in St. Charles and Terrebonne parishes versus cleaning densely populated Kenner is beyond unfair. Regarding the days when IV Waste claimed it delivered more to the landfill than it received, the company sent us a number of documents, but none of their calculations cleared up the discrepancies. Questionable spending didn't stop with IV Waste. Kenner paid one of its tree removal companies, Risk Tree Service, nearly $2 million after the storm, again sending checks with little to no explanation of the work performed. That included one invoice with just a one-page description of services that charged Kenner $813,000. Chad Pitfield also oversaw those payments. When you break it down, it cost Kenner $30 per resident. Compare that to tree removal by similar companies in other areas. $4.22 per resident in Jefferson Parish, $3.65 in Terrebonne, and just 46 cents per resident in New Orleans.
It just doesn't make any sense. When you look at the population of Orleans Parish and then you look at the population of Kenner, and you see that a very large, disproportionate amount of money per resident is going to Kenner when compared to Orleans Parish, when compared to Jefferson, when compared to Terrebonne, it just doesn't make any sense. The numbers are so off that I don't think you need to be an expert in tree removal or in accounting to understand that the numbers simply do not add up. These numbers simply cannot be justified using any system of measurement that anyone would use.
The attorney for Risk Tree Service, Lance Unglesby, released a statement that says in part, Risk Tree Service stands by the amount it billed for its services and has always strived to provide exceptional service. The city of Kenner experienced significant tree and debris damage compared to the surrounding areas. As a result, the mission was to clear the trees and debris safely and quickly. All of that spending seems to make no sense for Kenner taxpayers. Kenner paid more than $2.5 million after Ida to IV Waste and Risk Tree Service to clean up the extra trash and debris from the storm. But because of a decision made by the Zahn administration, FEMA might not reimburse Kenner that money, and instead, the city's 66,000 residents might have to cover the cost. FEMA reimburses local governments for extra expenses during disasters, but there are requirements those governments must follow. For trash and debris removal, FEMA requires each truck to have what's called a debris monitor, someone who makes sure what's being picked up qualifies for reimbursement. After Ida, Kenner had 3 companies removing most of the extra trash and debris: Risk Tree Services, IV Waste, and Series Environmental Services. Kenner hired the company Debris Tech to serve as the monitor for the work done by Series. However, emails from Kenner show when former Deputy CAO Chad Pitfield was asked if Debris Tech should also monitor IV Waste and Risk Tree, he said the company was only there to monitor the work done by Series.
I bet there isn't a municipality in the state of Louisiana that doesn't comply with the FEMA guidelines requiring monitoring and monitoring reports, because they know if they don't do this, they won't get paid back. Who would pay tens of thousands of dollars for
Millions,
disposal?
millions.
Millions of dollars, knowing you're not going to get paid back? And therefore the city of Kenner, which means the people who live in Kenner and pay taxes, they're paying all of these fees and they're not getting reimbursed. It's shocking. It's disgraceful. There can't be any realistic, lawful explanation for why they intentionally do not monitor certain disposal companies when they dump. And let's find out what the explanation is. I'm sure there is no legitimate explanation.
Kenner gave us a list of municipal employees who had claimed monitored IV waste in Rishtree. However, when we reached several of these employees, they told us they didn't do any debris monitoring. We also looked at timesheets for each of these employees, and in nearly 1,000 pages of documents, not one employee listed debris monitoring as a job duty on any day. FEMA also requires backup documentation from debris monitors. When we asked Kenner for that documentation, they told us none existed. That could put reimbursement in jeopardy and mean Kenner taxpayers, many of whom are still recovering from Ida, will foot the bill for the storm cleanup. And one more footnote to all of this: the debris monitoring is also a reimbursable expense by FEMA. So all of this money could have been reimbursed to the city of Kenner by federal taxpayers, but now Kenner residents may need to foot the bill. There was broad fallout from our series of investigations into this Isle of Secrecy. Despite Mayor Ben Zahn calling Pitfield one of his best employees, he was fired after our investigation began to air. The FBI investigations into both Chad Pitfield and Nikki Nicolosi are ongoing. Pitfield also resigned from his JPSO duties. In February, the Kenner City Council passed a resolution of no confidence in Mayor Ben Zahn. We paused our stories as the election season heated up, but the incumbent Mayor Ben Zahn lost his bid for re-election in March. He received just 25% of the vote. Election analysts say it might be the worst performance by an incumbent mayor in Louisiana history. We dedicated hundreds of hours in research and news time and thousands of dollars in legal fees to uncover potential corruption and mismanagement in Kenner, a city that for the last 4 years has been operating, as one expert called it, in an Isle of Secrecy.